Good afternoon. Thank you for being here. It's Tuesday. Where are we? Oh, Gevald, March 15th. We're a day or two away from Purim. Tomorrow night is Purim, and then Thursday, big Purim celebration. But for today, we are exploring one of the well-known stories of the Bible, but it always pays to give it a detailed analysis, a detailed examination in the text. And so today we're going to pick up where we left off yesterday. So I want to give a 30-second, I'll try to do 30 seconds. I may go over time.
Yeah.
I want to give a 30-second recap and orientation where we're holding it. Because last week was a painful, well, we already had a prelude to it, but last week we really could describe, it was the transition from King Saul to King David. Now, King Saul is alive and well and leading, but God has already, via his prophet, selected the next person. It was King David. But King David wasn't always King David, right? No one is born, or I shouldn't say no one is born great, but certainly no one is born accomplished and with the titles and the reputation that a person acquires through their good name and contribution. And so King David is a humble, obscure, youngest child, a shepherd. And although the prophet comes to find the new king, and it's going to be in the house of Jesse, or in Hebrew, Yishai, no one thinks to invite David because he's the young one and he's seemingly irremarkable, or he's not remarkable. But ultimately, it's proven that David is going to be the future king. In a private, or relatively private, low-key ceremony, he is formally installed or anointed or appointed by the prophet, by God. But no press releases go out, no tweets, no Facebook posts. And so life continues. And ultimately, we know the Jewish people being led by King Saul have to contend with their enemies and with the Philistines. And we read last week how they're being taunted by a particular Philistine who doesn't have a name yet. And he's taunting the people to send someone to fight him in combat. And no one knows what to do. No one is able to take him on. And as this is happening, King David is sent by his father to check on his brothers, because his older brothers, they were heroes. They were warriors in the battle and the defense of Israel. Young David, the shepherd, is sent to bring food and to check on them and to give back a report. And interestingly enough, there's a little bit of a echo, a reminiscence of Joseph. Not at all the same, but Joseph too is sent by his father to check on the brothers. And although with Joseph there is a 22 painful detour, King David is ultimately thrust into the spotlight. And that's what we're going to read about with God's help today. And so thank you for being here. We'll share the screen.
And how old was David?
At this time, I don't have an age. Do we have an age? Did someone have an age to suggest?
You said he was young, so I just wanted to know how
he was a young man, but we do not have an exact age.
Okay.
And so we are now Samuel chapter 17, middle of the chapter. I'm just going to bounce back a few verses. So Jesse tells his son, take some corn. I don't think it was actually corn, but that's how they translate it. It was toasted grain, bread, and cheese. Find your brother's commanding officer, see how they're doing, get back regards from them, and go to the front, because Saul and the brothers of David and all of Israel were in the valley of Elah in a war against the Philistines. The Philistines, of course, were a seafaring people. They lived on the coast. Well, they didn't always live, but they moved to the coast of Israel. They were at this point in a militarily strong position, bothering the Jewish people, restricting their lifestyle. And Saul, of course, as king, is tasked to take them on. Next morning, David left. Again, we read this last week, which is why I'm kind of going through it fast, but I want to pick up, at a reasonable place. So David leaves someone else in charge of his flock. We know he was a shepherd. Again, another flashback to the Hebrews of old and the family of Jacob. They were all shepherds. And, from then till this day, shepherding was one of the prominent industries of the Jewish people. And so David finds a replacement. He gets a substitute. He takes the food. He sets out as his father Jesse or Yishai instructed him. He reaches the military, here they say barricade. He reaches the limits of the camp as the army was going out to the battle lines, shouting the war cry. Israel, the Philistines, draw up their battle lines opposite each other. David leaves the stuff with the man in charge of the baggage and goes to the battle line. So he leaves the stuff, right? If the boys are in battle, they don't want to be lugging around loaves of bread and a big thing of cheese. Cheese is wonderful, but not when you're trying to fight for your life. And so he leaves the gifts with the person that's in charge of the stuff. Then he goes to the battle line because he wants to see his brothers. And so while he was talking to them, here we go. This is the verse that introduces the famous story. So David goes down to the battle lines to check on his brothers. And while he's talking, the champion, whose name was Goliath, in Hebrew, Goliath, the Philistine of Gath, stepped forward from the Philistine ranks and spoke the same words as before. Already last week, we were introduced to a man. We didn't have his name then. We know he's Goliath, a large, imposing, fearsome warrior of the Philistines, taunting the Israelites and asking if there is anyone who's willing to take him on. When the men of Israel saw the man, they fled in terror. And so we always imagine, and he's being portrayed as such, and I suppose he was, a giant, a large man. Who can take him on? The men of Israel were saying among themselves, did you see that man come out? He comes out to defy Israel. The man who kills him will be rewarded by the king with great riches. He'll also give him his daughter in marriage and give a tax holiday, an exemption to his father's house in Israel. So Saul is desperate. He needs this warrior taken out, and he's ready to promise the world to anybody who is so brave or perhaps foolish enough to take on this fearsome warrior. And so that's what's happening here. Saul is promised riches, his daughter, and a tax reprieve. Now, this, of course, these details today ring through many of the legends, the fairy tales, the tall tales past, no doubt influenced by this story. The king who's willing to give it all away if only someone would be brave enough to step up and defend the people of Israel. No one wants to do this. And so you have this young man, he's not in battle, he's not trained. He just went to deliver some cheese and bread. And David asked the men standing near him, what's going to be done for the man who kills that Philistine and removes this shame from Israel? What's the shame from Israel that they cannot move past and they cannot shake this menace? Who's that uncircumcised Philistine who dare defy the ranks of the living God? And so here we get a sense of what a good Hebrew insult must have been in the time of King David. So to call a person uncircumcised was considered something that was repulsive to the Jewish people, of course, with a tradition of. So that's a funny insult, but nonetheless an insult. So he says, who is this guy who is going to keep on taunting us, defying God? Because David is new. The soldiers are familiar. This is a daily occurrence. But David hasn't been on the battle, and there was no CNN or Fox News sending pictures from the front, and so he doesn't know what's going on. Troops told him the same words that would be done for the man who killed him, which were, namely, riches, the daughter, etc. Excuse me. Now, the weird thing is King David must have had some knowledge of the king. He knows the king. He probably knew the king's family, because remember, he was playing music on occasion when the king was feeling down. But King David was not initiated to the art of battle. He was not welcome to that part of the world. He was a part-time musician, freelance entertainer for the king, but nothing more than that. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him speaking to the men, Eliab became angry with David. He said, why did you come down here? And with whom did you leave these few sheep in the wilderness? I know your impudence and your impertinence. You came down to watch the fighting. So his oldest brother is mad at the little baby. Instead of doing his responsibility, he's going to seek action. He wants to have a front row seat for the next military clash. Frankly, I understand Eliab's position. And of course, we talk many times about the dynamics of a family and an older sibling and a younger sibling. And again, to point out, older and younger isn't always age. It's sometimes you can have a younger sibling who bears more of a responsibility. But it seems like at this point, King David was not King David. He was young David, was just, was the young kid of the family. And he was probably, maturing takes time. And so the older brother just knows the kid who wants to watch the action. So imagine there's a national crisis. The family's understaffed because all the men are at battle. And here's King David shirking his duties. I'm sorry, I keep on calling him King David. Here's young David seemingly shirking his duties, getting to watch the scene. Now, why was David there? Because his father sent him.
Mm-hmm.
Why was David there? To supply provisions for his brothers.
Mm-hmm.
But his brother had a little bit of a temper.
Yeah.
Now, maybe you remember a line that we read last week. Samuel is looking for the future king, and he meets all the brothers. And when he meets Eliab, he says, this is not the guy. And I told you it's because he was prone to anger. Get a temper. Now, to have a temper is to be human. To be a king, you need to be superhuman. And so this anger, although it happened after that story, ends up being a disqualifying characteristic for this Eliab. But we understand Eliab. I understand him. There's a battle going on, and you're just schmoozing with the soldiers, distracting them from honing their skills. And who's helping dad at home? Old dad is, none of us can be there with him. At least you can't go to battle. Take care of the parents. And David replies, come on, what have I done now? I was only asking. And he turned away towards someone else, and he asked the same question. So David's really curious. The wheels are turning in his head. There is something going on. And he asked the same question, and he got the same answer. The things David said were overheard and were reported to Saul, who had brought him over. So Saul hears that young David is asking questions that are seemingly above his rank. And so Saul needs to find out what's going on.
So Saul is still the king at this point.
Saul is the king.
Correct? Okay. Mm-hmm.
So Saul hasn't brought over. And David says to Saul, because hold on, David's asking of the questions. Come, Shammai. David's questioning points to an interest. And obviously they're desperate for anyone. Because also realize even if the first Israelite would take him on and fail, they would be able to study that combat and have, additional intelligence, additional ideas how to take him on. And so Saul calls over David. David says, no one's courage should fail them. Or man's courage shouldn't fail them. But everyone here are a bunch of wussies. Said, your servant will go and fight the Philistines. I'll take him on. Again, this is the famous story of David and Goliath. So it starts with David randomly happening to be in the battlefield, hearing the taunts, asking too many questions, ticking off his brother, who probably also had a sense of wanting to protect him. Didn't want his baby David getting crushed by Goliath. And all of a sudden, here we have David volunteering. Now, unfortunately, right now we're dealing with the terrible events in Ukraine. And so you have a whole bunch of macho people volunteering to go to Ukraine to help, to fight. But you know what? There are many videos of folks emerging and saying, oh, we thought it would be a breeze, but really, and unfortunately, battle is not a game. War is terrible, painful. There's no good war.
No.
There might be a necessary war, but there's no good war. And battle inevitably, sorry. Sorry, one second. Yeah. So basically, battle is no joke, and to volunteer when you don't know what battle is immature and silly. And so that's what they think David is doing. Saul says to David, you can't go to the Philistines and fight him. You're a boy. And this guy is a professional.
So, Rabbi, when you see pictures of David and Goliath, David is a small child. He's not a full-grown man, correct? He's a boy. He's a boy, right?
Yeah, I don't think he was literally a boy. I think he was a teenager.
A teenage? Well, that's what I'm saying. He wasn't a
He wasn't a fully developed, fully trained,
right.
you know.
But I
Just for-
just when you see pictures of it, he's young, very
Right.
young.
Now, to
Yeah.
point out, none of these illustrators
Yeah.
there, they all have access to the same texts we do. But in all these pictures, we see, a big warrior and a young man,
man. Yeah.
probably after bar mitzvah.
Yeah, teenager maybe, or
Yeah,
younger than 20. I don't know.
yeah,
That's
something like that.
yeah,
A young man.
hmm
You know, the thing about Rabbi about war is that the Ukrainians that volunteered is extremely frightening. You know, they never heard, you know,
Right,
and what they do in the IDF is when they have their maneuvers with the conjunction with the Air Force.
right.
in
And in fact,
order
I didn't
to
intend to take
get
a
the
full,
soldiers used to it,
but yeah,
they use live ammunition so that that the new soldiers get used to what it sounds like a war. Otherwise, you know, without it, it really scares you. They had someone come over, like these soldiers that came over with the idea, and they weren't used to it. And when they saw planes coming overhead, well, they didn't know if they were Israel planes or what. They just jumped in a hole. I mean,
Yeah.
but you can't blame them. But you know,
no.
you
So
have
let's
to,
see
you
what-
have
let-
to get used to the sounds of war.
Yeah. So again, war
Terrible.
changed a lot, and yet not at all. And let's take a look at what King David does. No one expects or takes King David seriously because he wasn't King David. He was described as a young boy, a lad. Again, probably after bar mitzvah, but you can't fight a battle with a fountain pen. You got it as a bar mitzvah present.
Yeah.
Well, unless you're. All right, let's take a look.
Well, he might have gotten a slingshot for his bar
Let's see if he had another toy.
No, but what's good to what saved the Israelis is their strategies. If a
mhm,
general has good strategy, that's what's in the miracles. As you shown me over the years, that the miracles seem to have saved the Israelis as well. They just come from I don't know where, but
Yep.
they show up.
Yeah.
You
All right,
know?
let's take a look. Let's see this story, and then we'll. Thank you, Sheila, for sharing that. But Saul said to David, "You cannot go fight that Philistine and fight him. You're a boy. He's been a warrior since his youth." And David says, "No, your servant has been tending his father's sheep. If a lion or bear came, carried off an animal from the flock, I would go fight it, rescue it from its mouth. If it attacked me, I'd strike it by the beard, strike it down and kill it." So David says, "I know how to fight. I've been a shepherd. We've had to use extreme measures to push back against a lion, a tiger, a bear. I know how to fight. Your servant has killed both lion and bear. That uncircumcised Philistine shall end up like one of them, for he has defied the ranks of the living God." So David adds a spiritual
Yep.
component here. This is not just a random person. This is an evil person defying God. And David is going to represent God. Now, it sounds crazy, except all of us have heard the story. And so we know ultimately it works out. And so he's now debating with the king. The king takes kindly to David, to young David. He enjoys his company. He thinks he's talented. He doesn't want him to die before he has a chance to develop into a person, an adult. And so the king says, "Don't do this." And King David says, "I could do it. I have experience."
Mhm.
And again, for him, it worked out. But, talking about Ukraine and some of the folks that are volunteering, just because you once wrestled, somebody doesn't mean that you have what it takes to be in battle. So
Mhm.
David goes on and says, "The Lord who saved me from lion and bear will save me from the Philistines." "Then go," Saul told David, "and may God be with you." So
Mm.
Saul is only going to fight hold on. I'm sorry. Saul is only going to fight. I'm sorry. He's only going to argue with David as much as possible. If David really insists,
Okay.
oh, I guess Saul's like, wow, the first optimistic person. Optimism is got to be worth something.
Absolutely.
And so,
Look at how we won the war from the British,
mhm,
right? They
there
didn't
are
know how
many.
to fight.
There are
They
many.
were farmers, they were whatever. They didn't know anything about war,
Absolutely, absolutely. It's true. It's true. In history, there
right? In
you have many
history,
times. It is not. Many times the underdog can win.
we were the underdog.
When we study the history of the state of Israel, of America,
America,
and
right?
Halavai, Ukraine will have a similar
I hope so.
ending. So the underdog can win, but
Right.
an underdog is still an underdog for a reason. The odds are still not stacked in their favor. But one of the things that we might describe as the gift the underdog has is the determination,
To do
and
it.
losing is not an option, and sometimes the spirit, the optimism, right? So we could say that was probably the case in addition to God's great miracles in the state of Israel, in the War of Independence.
That's
You
right.
might say that in the Revolutionary War as well. The
Yeah.
Americans couldn't afford to, they had to put everything into it. And the British were soldiers from overseas and eventually the smartest thing is to leave.
Mhm.
But let's go back to our story. The Lord, David went on, said, who saved me from the lion and the bear will save me from the Philistines. And King Saul says, okay, maybe David knows something I don't know.
Mhm.
And to show Saul's appreciation, Saul clothed David in his own garments. He placed a bronze helmet on his head and fastened a breastplate on him. Why do you think Saul gave his armor?
Well, Saul wasn't going to use it at that time. He
Saul's not
wanted,
using it.
right, and he wanted to give David every opportunity to perhaps do what he says he can do.
Yeah, I'll say something else. Saul probably had the highest quality
Yes, that's true.
armor. And so Saul wants to give him every chance to survive,
Chance, right?
to live another day. And this is actually a sign of deep love, adoration, and concern.
Yes.
And so this is a credit to Saul. Unfortunately, sometimes, and I could even say this from experience, sometimes we do something with total magnanimity. Is that the right word? We're entirely magnanimous and giving and gracious, and you will give up on something for a friend.
Yes.
But then afterwards, you're like, maybe I shouldn't have done that. Feel a little bad.
Well, if you gain the appreciation,
Right.
then you say, okay, I did it and that was good. But if you don't gain appreciation, then you might have second thoughts.
Right.
Right, I
So
agree.
you
Mhm.
have tickets to some kind of very hard to watch
Right.
show or game or something, and you give it away because your friend really wants it. And then you say, should I have done that? Or something more than that. Sometimes let's say you're in a bidding war for a property with a friend, or I don't know. Sometimes you give up or you do something that's very magnanimous, but sometimes, we're humans and we could come to feel regretful about it.
Mhm.
And so that might take place. But meanwhile, Saul, in a very gracious and fatherly, concerned way, gives David the very best armor. David girded his sword over his garment. Then he tried to walk,
Ah,
but he wasn't used to it. And David says, "Oi, I can't wear this armor. It's too bulky. It's too heavy." And as we know, warriors wearing armor were protected, but also had their movement restricted. And so for certain forms of combat, armor is necessary. But
mhm.
for other techniques, you'd rather be agile and flexible. And so David takes off the garments. Rashi, who I just mentioned a moment ago, says that Saul does it in an act of being very magnanimous and feels bad. So he says maybe David realized that it's going to cause jealousy. And David doesn't want the king to be jealous of him. So he says, better I shouldn't wear this armor, even if it puts him at risk, than to trigger.
The king was going to be jealous of him? I'm not sure about that.
Because David knows that David's going to be the next king.
David knows this?
Yes, because he's already been communicated about that by the prophet.
So, okay.
He wants to be very mindful to not appear to be usurping king's position. And so David ultimately takes off the armor.
Yeah, but couldn't it have been almost insulting to Saul by taking it off?
It could have been.
Extend himself.
Well, that's why David says, I don't know how to fight with this. This is not my way. Remember, David was a shepherd. When he was a shepherd and defends his flock, he never had to wear armor.
He didn't have armor, right?
So David says, listen, I'd rather do it my way, even if it's less ideal, but I'm really good at it. And so he takes his staff, his stick, takes a few smooth stones. Really, it's 5 stones from the river, puts them in the pocket of his shepherd's bag, sling in hand, and he goes towards the Philistine.
But Rabbi, could it have been possible that because he was contacted by God or a prophet that he thought that he would be saved? Was that another reason?
Very likely he felt that he was a person of destiny.
Yeah.
And
that he was going to be king and then he would survive. So maybe that attributed to his bravery as well.
Yes, bravery, confidence.
Yeah.
He knew that he was destined for greatness.
Right.
And he figures maybe this is a way that he'll be,
rewarded,
pushed forward into an honorable position without it being a clash between him and Saul. Look,
right.
I don't want to give too many details away, but Saul promises his daughter's hand in marriage. So he figures, if I have to usurp my father-in-law, the king, let us best be family. And maybe it'll happen in a natural course where when Saul retires or passes on, then David can succeed. And so David, no doubt, had many different factors and considerations in his mind that gave him confidence.
Right.
And so again, he takes these stones, he takes a sling in hand, and he goes towards the Philistines. Now, I don't think it was actually a slingshot the way we imagine. I think it was more a kind of,
I see what you're saying. What do you call that then? That thing?
It's also a sling, but it's just
sling.
It's not using using the tension of a rubber band. But it captures the built up.
There must be a name for it. There must be.
Isn't there a rock or something on the end of the string though?
Yes.
Yeah, a rock.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
But there's got to be a name for that. We have to look later. Okay.
The Philistine, and remember something else. Well, we'll see. We'll see the story. The story has all the details. The Philistine, that's how you say it. The Plishti, the Philistine, the combatant, meanwhile, is coming closer to David, and he has his own shield bearer.
Oh, he had somebody else with him?
Not David, but the Goliath.
Oh, okay.
When the Philistinian caught sight of David, he scorned him because he was a boy, ruddy and handsome. He looked like this spoiled, a person that spends years in battle becomes rugged and hardened. And you can see that they've been actively bodybuilding and prepping, and they're rough. And King David had this very delicate, good looking, models are good for some things, but not if you have to have someone representing you in combat. You'd rather someone that's, a little closer to living real life on the streets than someone that lives a protected life. And so David doesn't look like the guy that's going to do in Goliath.
Well, that may be relaxed Goliath.
Oh, so
there's
a lot of analysis of the story.
Didn't think that David was going to do anything to him, so he might have been more relaxed.
So he put down his guard. David wasn't dressed typically.
Right.
There is a famous book.
Like a strong team, they let down their guard.
There's a famous book, which it's been a while since I read. I don't know where I have it. By Malcolm Gladwell, David and Goliath. And he has very fascinating theories about both what made Goliath a giant and how David was able to ultimately prevail. And it has a lot to do with the underdog occasionally having certain strengths that allow them to overcome adversity. It's an interesting book, an interesting theory. But anyways, the Philistine calls to David and says, am I a dog that you're going to come against me with sticks? At least honor me by fighting with, real weapons.
Yeah.
And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. So the Philistine is insulted. The Philistine said to David, come here. I'll give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field. I'll kill you and leave your corpse to rot and to be consumed by wild animals.
Lovely.
Now, in this kind of combative situation, it seems like banter, taunts were part of the cultural package.
Mm-hmm.
And so David replies to the Philistine, you come against me with sword and spear and javelin. Javelins are in the headlines, by the way, but they're different javelins.
Mm-hmm.
And I come against you in the name of the Lord of hosts. So you come confidence in your weapons,
Mm-hmm.
confidence in your tools, but I come with confidence in God, the Lord of hosts,
Mm-hmm.
God of the rank of Israel, whom you have defied.
Mm-hmm.
So who is more powerful, a javelin or God?
God.
You see what happens? I Googled javelin, and instead of getting a picture of an ancient javelin, which is a kind of spear, we get pictures of anti-tank missiles, anti-tank or anti-tank missiles, the javelin, which of course is in current.
But now I want to know what that sling was called.
So a javelin, just to clarify, what is the difference? This is Google. What is the difference between a javelin and a spear?
Mhm.
I always imagine them to be the same, but in this verse,
Me too,
there's
yeah.
sword, spear, and javelin. So Google tells us a javelin is a light spear thrown with the hand used as a weapon, while a spear is a long stick, sharp tip used as a weapon for throwing or thrusting, anything used in a thrusting motion. And so a spear was more likely used in you held onto it and it was in some kind of formation. The javelin was more of a projectile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And anyways, so
Either ways, it's unpleasant.
it's unpleasant to be at the wrong end of a
Yeah,
javelin or a spear.
absolutely. Yeah.
So again, David says, you have weapons. I've got God. I've got a superpower. Therefore, this day the Lord will deliver you into my hands. I'll kill you and cut off your head. I'll give your carcass of the Philistine, your carcass, your fellow carcasses, to the birds of the sky, the beasts of the earth, and all the earth shall know there is a God in Israel. And so David knows how to give back a little.
A zuz.
He knows how to talk.
Confident.
He knows how to talk confident. He knows how to give as well as receive. And so he taunts Goliath back. The whole assembly shall know that the Lord can give victory without sword or spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he'll deliver you into our hands. So right now, what we imagine, and this is really the understanding of the story, is David is extremely under-prepped. He's not armed. He's not wearing armor. He doesn't have defense. His defense is flawed. His offensive team is not great. But somehow, with godly intervention, he overcomes, as we'll see.
Mm-hmm.
Alternately, we could say that David had a very good strategy, which is to appear low key, get under the radar, and David knew what David knew best. And so when the Philistine began to advance towards him again, David quickly ran up the battle line to face the Philistines. He wants to be in a good visual position.
Mm-hmm.
David put his hand into his bag. He took out a stone and slung it. And he struck the Philistine in the forehead. Again, this guy is wearing a ton of armor, but his precision is so good, David, that he's able to cause the projectile to land in the one spot that's vulnerable.
Uh-huh.
Think of a picture of a how do you call it, a helmet or armor of ancient times. There's always going to have to be some space.
Space, yeah.
And so he manages with precision to shoot the rock exactly where he is unprotected. And he does it with so much strength, the stone sank into his forehead. So it wasn't like a little pebble that flicked him, but it actually punches in. And Goliath fell face down on the ground. So in one motion, in one moment, he just flops down. Imagine getting hit in the head with a hammer, or God forbid, a bullet.
No.
We might say that in a sense, David channels, it's not a bullet, but it's that idea. where you don't need a scary big sword or a scary sword or a big spear will not prevail against a gun that has good aim. But anyway, so he uses his little rock and he falls this terrible, scary, menacing Philistine. Thus, David bested the Philistine with sling and sword, struck him down, killed him. David didn't even have a sword, just a little rock. This is the story. We're not done yet, but this is the story of David and Goliath. What happens next? Maybe a little gruesome. David ran up, stood over the Philistine, grasped his opponent's sword, pulled it from his sheath, and with it he dispatched him, cut off his head. The Philistines saw their warrior was dead. They ran. So all it takes is losing their champion, and all of a sudden the morale shifts. And you may notice this is like the third time, I think, in the battles of Saul versus the Philistines, where initially the Philistines have the advantage, and when something turns in the favor of the Israelites, they all panic.
And the Israelites are
They
always.
run.
And the Israelites are all of a sudden willing to come out from where they're hiding
They're out.
Right.
and to get involved. And so the men of Israel and Judah rose up with a war cry. They pursued the Philistines all the way up to Gai, up to the gates of Ekron, which is an important settlement of the Philistines, as you may recall. And the Philistines fell mortally wounded along the road to Shearim, up to Gath and Ekron. And so suddenly there's this massive victory. The Philistines are running. The Israelites are chasing. Then the Israelites return from chasing the Philistines and looted their camp. Because remember, they had a big camp over there. And all of a sudden they run away. And so people have, I don't know, probably swords and food and maybe pictures of, I don't know, whatever a person might take in their tent. And so now the Israelites loot those tents. David took the head of the Philistine and brought it to Jerusalem. David kept the trophy. And
Wait a minute, Rabbi, back up for a minute. Was there a Jerusalem then? Yes.
Lynn, you're asking a brilliant, important
Because I
question.
didn't think there was.
I was hoping you wouldn't. No, I knew you were going to ask.
I will notice everything, you know that.
Lynn asked a brilliant question. She knows what we know, which is that Jerusalem is still not a Jewish
Established.
city. King David only captures Jerusalem as a king. And so this city is not a Jewish city. It wasn't even called Jerusalem.
Right.
And so if you'll take a note here in this comment, David kept the head as a trophy. And when he eventually established his capital as Jerusalem, he keeps the head with him. So
Well,
you're
wait a
right.
minute.
David didn't go home to Jerusalem. He
No.
was a youngster. He probably went home to his dad, and he
This
was
is
very
future.
secretive.
This
He
is
has a
future.
carry-on that he doesn't
How
let his
long did
family.
he have to
Oh,
keep that? Wait a minute,
Oh, God.
Rabbi, for how long did he have to keep that head?
I want to move past that.
He seems
Wait
like
a
he
minute,
held on to it.
I missed that. What did you
Oh,
say,
I-
Rabbi? Say it again.
I mean, I was joking, but I said he probably he walked into the house with this carry-on. He wouldn't let anybody touch. And when his parents found out what he had in there, no, I'm kidding.
Okay, but Rabbi, answer my question. How long did he have to keep the head?
So the interpretation of the verse
Yeah,
that resolves your question, which was a really good question, would indicate that he must have preserved
the
the
head.
head.
For how long?
It seems like he must have kept the head. He must have. They probably had what is it called, taxonomists or whatever. You know how they mount
Right.
the head of, and they
Yeah.
must have. And again,
For how long did he have to keep this head?
well, he didn't have to, but he chose to. It was
Oh, I
probably
know.
But how long was it?
That's
A
just
year,
for the-
guess.
2 years, 10
for the
years?
duration of his career. We're talking many years, at least 7 years.
No, but before he became king.
It's at least 7 years until he becomes king in Jerusalem.
Okay,
Not more.
thank you.
So we're talking about a
Well,
long.
I don't know how long the head lasted.
Well, he must have done. This is a pretty gruesome and horrifying thing to
Why do we
conceive.
pass this?
No, this is
You hear
interesting.
this?
No,
No, you got a better.
this is
disposition
interesting.
than
How
this.
long, I don't know how long
I
he
don't
kept the
find it
head.
interesting. I can move on from this.
All right.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, Lynn, I want to compliment you as always. I know that if there's a question that's asked, I know you're going to catch it. So thank you.
Yes,
Yeah.
I appreciate it too.
Thank you, guys. But this is the way my mind works.
No, it's great.
It's
It's
good,
great.
it's good.
I have to get the answers. And when I see something that doesn't look right, I'll speak
You
up,
catch
you
it.
know?
You catch
I
it.
think
It's
it's
great.
very good.
Yeah,
I was thinking the same.
Thank you.
I was just wondering who else is going to ask the question, and you got it.
I got it, right?
So now,
And I don't want to know.
right. Now here's where life gets complicated for David. David's a hero. David is a hero. But sometimes being a hero takes growing pains. And there are social costs to being thrust into the spotlight. There are family challenges. And not everyone is going to be enamored with a new hero. Most importantly, the old heroes,
Be jealous.
right? When a new superhero arrives on the scene, the old ones are going to feel like they're has-beens, and there's going to be jealousy. And so,
But Rabbi, one quick question, I'm
Yes.
sorry. But didn't Saul know at this time that he was not going to be king? Didn't someone tell him,
He knows.
his mentor tell him that he was not going to continue to be king? So didn't he know that?
so Saul knew that his career or
Over,
he knew that his dynasty is not going to continue.
right?
He didn't know precisely when he's going to actually be taken out of office. He just knew that things are winding down for him.
Did he know? it was
Right.
David?
Mhm.
No, and he had no clue who the person is going to be.
Okay,
So now let's see. Saul saw David going to assault the Philistine. He asked his army commander, Abner, whose son is that boy? It's possible. And Abner replied, by your life, your majesty, I don't know. The commentary right away asks, Rashi right away says, hold on, didn't we know? Didn't we already say that David was involved?
Didn't Saul give him? He gave him
So
the
really, hold on. Saul knew David.
order? Give him the
David
order?
worked in his palace. David communicated with Saul and tried on his armor. And so the question wasn't, who's that boy? He knew it was David. He's asking possibly a deeper question. Where does this young kid have such extensive military strategy, tactic, and prowess? Where does he get this from?
and chutzpah.
Chutzpah.
He had chutzpah.
And really, it's possible that his question was, he realizes maybe this is the competition. Maybe
Mm,
this is the successor. This is what Rashi says. So I'm going to translate for you. Didn't Saul know who this kid was? The verse attests to the fact that Saul knew him. But what he saw was incredibly strategically sound decisions. And now Saul starts asking, does he come from a kingly family? Does he come from Judah? Is he the one that's going to be the king?
He asks that question.
He realizes that something is going on. And so
Mhm.
he asks his advisors. And so what happens is his advisors tell him, you may wish to impugn his heritage, bring up problems, give him challenges, challenge his heritage. Because David's mother came from a foreign tribe of the Moabites.
Mm.
And the Jewish people are not meant to intermarry with the Moabites because the Moabites were famous enemies of the Jewish people. And they're going to attempt to disqualify David as king by virtue of questionable heritage.
Mm.
So nobody married them, no one dared to marry into them?
Hold on. Let's take it step by step. I'm just giving you a possible interpretation behind the scenes. His question isn't, who is this kid? His question is, who is this kid? What's the real story? I know who he is. And sometimes someone, Lynn, you had a person in your building who you know as a Ukrainian boxer.
Yeah,
And all of a sudden now he's in the headlines. He's fighting.
right.
He's fighting, and his brother
With
is
his
the mayor
brother.
of Kiev.
his brother is the mayor of.
And so
of
you
the-
knew who he
Yeah,
was, but all of a
Yeah.
sudden you're learning
More about
more,
him.
a whole
Yeah.
lot more. This is
Yeah.
someone that's really, a person of character, of
I
bravery.
thought he was just a boxer.
Yeah. I actually remember everyone was talking. There's a boxer in the penthouse.
Yeah,
I
in
remember
my
that.
elevator.
Yeah. Oh, it was in your elevator. Okay.
And you know what? He and his brother said to Ron one day, if you need us to do anything for you, like to knock somebody out, let us know. I thought that was very good.
So you're saying they had some experience throwing a punch or two.
Yeah.
And so Abner, who is his commander, says, and Abner is also a relative of Saul. Remember, it was his uncle, I think, or brother-in-law. He says, I don't know. So Saul says, find out who this guy is. I want you to hire a private eye, and I want you to pull up the full profile. I want to know who we're dealing with. This kid did great, but I have a feeling, says King Saul, this is going to be our downfall. This kid's going to be
Right.
trouble.
Mhm.
Saul wasn't wrong. Saul wasn't wrong.
Did God want to make it tough on David to become king? Like, want to?
By the way, there's an alternate. I'm sorry. There is an alternate interpretation that's a whole lot more charitable. I'm saying that Saul is afraid of David. Well, we could also give it, and then I want to answer your question. There's an alternate perspective, which is Saul wants to honor this young boy. He is the hero. And now that he wants to honor him, he wants to come up. He wants to make sure to introduce him with all of his titles, with his heritage. He wants to be sure that he has the full picture.
Right.
And so that's a whole lot more of a charitable take. And so
And
both
also
are.
maybe Saul, knowing that his kinghood or whatever it is was ending, maybe he thought, gee, this guy's got something,
Yeah.
you know?
If he
maybe
has to
he
lose
could
his
be the next
job, it
king.
shouldn't be to some pushover. It should be to
Yeah.
somebody, you know.
Right.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And so Saul wants a profile. So David returned after killing the Philistines. Abner took him, brought him to Saul, with the head of the Philistines still in his hand. Now, we can also imagine he must have been a little shell-shocked. This young kid was going to deliver cheese and bread. He didn't think that he's going to end up in this crazy battle. And so he wins. He does it. You know, there's a lot of adrenaline and instincts. And all of a sudden, before you know it, he's just like looking around, holding this head of this giant Philistinian or Philistine. And so Saul says, my son, whose son are you? Who are you? Where do you have this bravery? Where do you have this great? And also, I owe your family a reprieve from taxes. So I need to know who you guys are.
Mhm.
So David says, I am the son of Jesse, the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem.
Why does he use the word servant? I mean,
Humility. This is the king, and this is a way of
all right.
all citizens are subservient
Okay.
to the king.
Mhm.
And certainly being that he knows that, you know, the cat's going to be out of the bag eventually, he wants to play it really delicate here. And
Mhm.
so he does. And so this takes us to the end of chapter 18, the story of David and Goliath, the story that really thrusts David into the spotlight. He is a national hero, and we haven't even yet witnessed his victory parade. We now just have this young boy without armor, without a sword or spear, takes down Israel's most menacing opponent, is victorious. The Jewish people are then able to pursue their enemies, being free once again of their oppressive torment.
Mhm.
And David is really the hero of the day. And Saul wants to know all about him, maybe to honor him, maybe to extend courtesy to the family,
Mhm.
and no doubt as well to find out who his competition is about to be, who his soon-to-be competition is all about.
Why didn't David mention his mother? Who was
Why didn't David mention his mother? That's a good question.
Wouldn't she be, you know?
He was probably defensive about his mother, because we said she came from a Moabite
Yeah, but
background.
She had converted.
Certainly
So wouldn't that show that David's already, you know?
complicated, but he must have been
Israelite?
complicated. I mean, the answer, I could say he was self-conscious about it, or
protective.
maybe in a society, in a military society, they were more curious about the father because it was who was the warrior who trained this warrior. And so usually the father had more to do with training
But the
the
father
young.
had not converted, right?
No, the father was, they were all Jewish.
Okay.
No,
Mother
for sure.
converted that became Jewish.
The father was from Judah. The father was from a
Right.
famous Jewish family.
Mhm.
So again, the real answer is probably in a battle setting, then the person was honored and recognized by the father. We'll do a few more verses. This is obviously a very interesting and important story, and it's nice to get all the details.
It's a great story.
Isn't
I
it
love
great?
it.
Listen, there's a reason why it's one of the top 5 biblical
Mhm.
stories that everybody knows. So let us take a look. When David finished speaking with Saul, Jonathan became really friendly. His soul became bound up with the soul of David. Jonathan loved David as himself. So Saul has a son who's the same age as David, and they strike up a friendship. And possibly, I could imagine Jonathan, being the son of a king, doesn't have a whole many friends because you're kind of isolated when your father's king.
Mhm.
And so now there is a friend who's worthy of friendship. If you're the son of the king, you want to be close to the big machers, and you
Mhm.
want to be in the company of a hero. And so Jonathan becomes a very dear and deep friend
Of
with
David.
King David.
Mhm.
And we're going to find out how deep this friendship goes, to the point where Jonathan is willing to celebrate David's triumph, even at the cost of his own family's monarchy. And so this is a deep friendship, to the point where the Mishnah, in the text Ethics of Our Fathers, say, you want to know the model, an ideal, selfless friendship? It's the friendship of David and Jonathan, where they're able to be friends, even when they're on 2 different sides of an insane conflict, which hasn't yet unfolded, but we're going to find out about it
Mhm.
in due time. And so Saul takes David into his service that day. He would not let him return to his father's house. This kid is too valuable, too much of a national hero. He's
Mhm.
not going to lend him to any other team. And by the way, do you remember when when the monarchy was first being established, and the Jewish people want the monarch? And one of the things that the prophet says to dissuade them is, he can just seize your kids into service. And here you have it. David went from being a shepherd to
Mhm.
really never being able to properly go home again. He's now
Mhm.
in service of the king.
Wow. Mhm.
Jonathan and David made a pact because Jonathan had loved him dearly. What is the pact? So Jonathan took off the cloak and tunic he was wearing, gave them to David, together with a sword, bow, and belt. So Jonathan is the I don't want to say spoiled, but he is the kid, son of the king, a warrior already. David is still dressed in his shepherd's clothes with whether it was a slingshot or another kind of sling. And so Jonathan is so impressed and becomes such dear friends that he actually gives him his own
Mhm.
battle equipment. And I'm sure Jonathan has a replacement made, but he honors him. And essentially, and also Jonathan was probably a macher in the military. And so this was
Mhm.
not just simply giving him his clothing, but this is a kind of appointment, elevation, and really giving him honor. Now realize, when you're the king or you're the king's crew and there's a rising star, you want to take ownership and bring them into your inner circle,
Mhm.
because the alternative is to have a
Right.
competing star. And so wisely and strategically correct, they adopt David and they really bring him into the inner circle, and they're proud and honored, and they can now, celebrate his triumph as their own. And now David goes out and he was successful in every mission. So David wasn't just a one-off, success story, but he becomes a dazzling new leader and person in the Jewish military effort.
Wow.
And he was successful in every mission which Saul sent him. And Saul puts him in command of all the troops. And this pleased all the troops and Saul's couriers as well. So basically, everyone agrees, everyone approves with David being appointed in this position. And it must have helped. David is a humble guy. He wasn't looking for covet. He wasn't looking for honor.
Mhm.
And even those who were overlooked for promotion acknowledge that the right thing is to install David.
Mhm.
And once again, I want to bring to your attention slight resemblance or slight reminiscence to the story of Joseph. Joseph had a complex family dynamic. He's the youngest. There's a little tension. He's eventually thrust into power, and he's an extremely successful person. And David is also similarly the youngest in the family, not so super celebrated. He's thrust into the spotlight and finds himself incredibly successful. Obviously, there are differences, but there's some common themes to the story. Now, here is the first sign of trouble. When the troops return from battle, and David returns from the front finally from killing the Philistines, the women of all the towns of Israel came out singing and dancing to greet their king Saul, with timbrels, shouting, and sistrums, different kinds of instruments. What's a sistrum? An ancient Egyptian percussion tool. And here, if you want to see it in an ancient Egyptian drawing, isn't that interesting? So that's anyone familiar with this tool?
No.
Me neither. Well, either it was a rattle or the metal was plucked. I don't know exactly.
But there's two different kinds, Rabbi. There's this and there's this. There's this one, which looks different.
You mean there's one that looks more like a rattle and one that looks more like
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. Well, let's do one more thing because it's interesting. Hold on a second.
You want to hear what it sounds like?
I want to hear what it sounds like.
Yeah.
Let me know if you can hear this. Now we know.
But I think the sounds will be different.
Like coins.
Wait a minute, because the
Sound.
metals will be made, it'll be made out of different metals, so maybe the sounds are not all the same. That's what
All
I
right,
was
let's
saying.
try one more.
This is the
Okay.
world's first reusable cotton swab. It can
Listen,
remove up to 10 times
we have a
more
group
ill.
on the computer. We might as well take advantage.
Now, was the other one bronze? I don't know.
I don't know. Let's hear. But I have a feeling it.
Sounds like money come out of coal machine.
I bet you it was a whole lot more musical.
Oh, gee.
That's nice.
Well, you get the point.
Yep.
Yeah.
I love to hear a song played with that. But anyways, so you learn something new.
Yep.
And so
we
they
did.
come, they greet him with song, with noise, with celebration. Just another minute. Thank you. The women sang, I just want to end with this line because this is the line that makes all the trouble. The women sang as they danced and they chanted, Saul has slain thousands. Compliment to Saul. David has slain tens of thousands.
Oy.
So the people pick up on the tension and create the tension first. And so as they're celebrating Saul, they're already giving more kavod, more honor to David. And we
David,
can imagine this was the beginning of trouble. Saul was distressed greatly and vexed about the matter. To David, they give tens of thousands. To me, only thousands. He's only missing one thing, which is the kingship itself. And from that day on, Saul
They
kept
were
a jealous
little bit-
eye
Jealous.
on
Yeah.
David.
Right.
The next day, an evil spirit of God gripped Saul. And so this sends Saul into a depression. And so here we see how really noble, great people can also be tormented by jealousy, ego.
And did
be a
Saul ever
person-
offer his daughter to David?
We'll see next week.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's the story of David and Goliath.
Very good,
That
Rabbi.
sends
This
David
was
into the
great.
spotlight. And
Very good.
thank you for joining us.
Thank
Those
you.
that are
This
here
was
on
a
the
great
Zoom in
story.
person. Happy
And you know
Purim.
what? Rabbi, I want to tell you, Barak sits right here and listens to everything that you say. Sits on the floor whenever I have the class. So he's absorbing all this.
That's very special.
Absolutely. Rabbi, are we lecture tomorrow,
Oh,
Wednesday
Yeah.
night.
you didn't.
Sheila, I'm
continue
coming
meditation?
tomorrow night. Yes, yes.
So hold on. Actually, I sent an email, but I realized because I didn't have you on the list. So I owe you.
What?
A few people asked me if we could push off the class by one night, not by one night, to cancel this week because of Purim. I sent an email, but I realized
Are we canceling it or what?
we're canceling just for this week. I'm sorry. I realized both of you. I don't
Okay,
have.
I didn't know. I would have been there.
There's a lot.
Sheila,
yeah,
thank-
there's a lot
class,
going on with
Sheila.
Purim.
All right, so
Yeah.
let me add you.
Yeah,
Because
No class then,
I
right?
added you manually, but I didn't put your
class,
email onto the list.
no.
Sorry.
because
Okay, but Rabbi,
a
please
lot of
send
things
me
going
the
on. for
recording
Purim.
of the.
I'm going
of
to send you the
other-
recording now.
Please, thank
So
you.
yeah, I have to see who else is not on the list because I sent out a broadcast. All right,
Okay,
thank you for
no class.
asking.
Okay,
And so we'll continue the next week and I'll send you the link.
okay.